Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick, and we're still giving you some time to decompress from our last book. Number 10 is the number that Tony and I have gone through so far. And so I've called upon friends to help me out and give us all some downtime, some buffer time, but that still means I get to edit all the shows. So, in fact, I think the guest shows are harder to edit than mine and Tony's, because I think I have some monstrosity in my mind where I care a lot more about making other people look good. So it's maybe a bit more work on me. So maybe I should rethink this. But today we welcome yet another returning guest from episodes 189 and 190, because he gave us so much good stuff in there. And that is, of course, Troy Fraiser from the mission field, all the way halfway around the world and an hour. Troy, thank you for joining me once again.
How are you doing? So it's funny because you said on the other side of the world. So I know it's morning in your time right now, and it is getting into evening over here. So we are quite literally on different sides of the planet, but that's fun. Yeah. And I'm very happy to be here.
Well, thanks. Well, again, I think it's just really hard to be my friend because first of all, I've cajoled Tony into meeting almost twice a month to go over the thing that he's paid to do for free with me and talk about philosophy and apologetics. Then I get Jeff Park for 2 episodes before this one to talk about the thing that he does for work, and that's schooling, and hoping that dads get more involved in schooling and not just kind of turn it over to mom. And now I've cajoled you to not really do anything other than tell me stories. And so you are the church history guy, but you're more than that, because you're a husband, a father, my friend, and it's probably in those declining orders that we know each other. And I appreciate you for coming on and letting me talk to you about church history. And so we'll kind of delve into that. Of course, Troy can be found on Revived Thoughts. And I mean, it seems like you've lessened shows, but still you have Revived Thoughts, you have Martyrs and Missionaries, you have Revived Devos, Revived Radio, you have Facebook, you have Twitter, you're starting a book. Yeah, finally. And also you are out there in the mission field and teaching at the same time. So, wow. I mean, why'd you even agree to come on?
Well, we stay busy. We try to keep use the most in every hour. I will say, you're hardly one to talk though when you talk about cajoling friends, because how many times have I sent you a sermon for our show, Revived Thoughts, and I was like, hey, this other dude dropped it. Do you think you can do it? And you'll be like, no problem. Is 2-hour turnaround enough time? I'm like, yeah. So I don't think you get to give any of that in my direction. Patrick he said you could find me on Revived Thoughts, but we take sermons of the past and bring them back to life. But you could also find Patrick there, because he is a very regular speaker in our rotation and has brought back to life many sermons, and some tough sermons where I do not send always the nicest stuff. I think sermons from the past are amazing and amazingly relevant today, but there's no denying that some of those sermons are tough because they're 17 or 1800 years old. And Patrick has embraced that challenge every time and brought many of them back to life and helped us out a lot.
It's more scary because I tend to quickly fall in love with people I knew nothing about. And so, I think of John Gill, the one that I read, and I just was devouring his history. And there's almost like no, other than his writings, there's nothing left of him. There's no church. There's no marker, maybe in a parking lot. You can kind of stand and be in the area. But yeah, 10 times I've been on Revived Thoughts. Always a pleasure. And actually, I think I might have been the first guest host talking about Thomas Aquinas. So that was a blast to do with you as well. And yeah, I've done let's see, I've done Gregory of Nazianzus. I have done the other Gregory of Nyssa. I just need a Basil the Great, and I've completed the trilogy for them. So if you got one,
I did know. So I almost said you've done the Cappadocian Fathers, but then I was like, I don't know if he's actually done all 3, but I definitely did know you've done 2 of them. So there you go. It looks like I've got to get another Basil sermon out, which I won't complain about because those are always really, really good.
Yeah.
However, so you've been all over our show and helped us out a ton and been a great aid in that way. And as you mentioned up top, we do have a lot of shows. Our primary shows now are Revived Thoughts and Martyrs and Missionaries. My wife runs Martyrs and Missionaries, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Stories of the past that cover martyrs and missionaries. Pretty straightforward. And then Revived Thoughts, taking sermons of the past and telling you the backstories and stuff. And it's funny you say that you fall in love with these people, because so do I. And it's also funny that you mentioned that they don't really have a lot of history left. And it's crazy. They really don't. I remember Joel and I once stood in the exact spot where D.L. Moody preached his last sermon in Kansas City. And it would be where he got too ill to continue. And that would not be where he died. But there's no marker for that. There's no remembrance of that. It impacted the entire world, but there's no memory of it. There's a story, I don't know how true it is, but there was a blog I found a long time ago where a guy went to visit George Mueller's old orphanage. And he was basically like, hey, I'm here to visit and learn about George Mueller. And the secretary was like, oh, give me a second. Walked around back, pulled out a cardboard box and was like, here's what we have for that stuff. And that's it. It was just the guy who did so much for the world, ran all these orphanages. All of his memory is just placed into a cardboard box in his own orphanage. You know what I mean? It's amazing how much this world forgets these people, but God does not. God sees everything they've been doing, and he remembers his children, I think, very fondly.
That's right. So so maybe we can kind of brush up towards our topic, which is talking a few church history stories that maybe spooky or weird or coincidental. I was reading a sci-fi story with the great Katie Room from periopsispress.com, and they talked about the Munster Rebellion. I was like, oh, this was the last time that Europe rejected communism, and hopefully one day soon we'll remember the Great Rebellion and what we did to communist of the just recently Reformation for them. So I was like, oh, I need to get Troy on to talk about this. But so if everything's forgotten, if we cannot remember our own great grandparents, why is church history even important for us? I mean, is it just Billy Graham forward for Americans? Is it just the Reformation forward for the crazy Calvinists and maybe Europe, but also we're kind of rejecting everything for the Enlightenment period even more? Why care? What's in it for me? And why tune in to the show to listen to sermons that were preached to people long forgotten as well?
Well, you see, I always say like this because I have to teach high schoolers, and they ask very similar questions. Why do I care about history? And I say, well, if you don't know where you're going, you don't, or if you don't know where you come from, you won't know where you're going.
That's right.
And if you don't understand how you got to this place in history, you will be led anywhere that this world would like to lead you. There's a reason that when Marxists started to infiltrate a country or their university system, they started with the English department, the language department, or history and the history departments, because math, sciences, those things can be corrupted later. But if people can speak freely, they're not going to get anywhere with Marxism. And if people don't know a better history than the one you give them, you're not going to get anywhere. If it's important to the Marxists to rewrite a country, rename everything, and retell a story of the history, then it should probably be important for us to know what the true history of this world is. And the thing is, the church has an amazing history full of wonderful people who did awesome things for God. And there are some negative things, too, that we can learn from as warning, cautionary tales that we don't want to repeat. But if we so often live in the moment right now as if these are the only things that matter, and yet I find that what we're going through right now, you might be going through a pretty tough situation in life, but it's probably nothing compared to the Black Plague when it hit Europe, or probably nothing compared to the Civil War, or some of the confusing persecutions throughout history. Just so many different things. We can learn so much about being bold in our faith by looking back and seeing what did people do back then. A very recent sermon I have that I just kind of am putting together, it was not even out yet, but it's by a man named Cyprian, and he was in a city that was under war, it was under persecution, it was under a famine and a plague all at the same time. And he was preaching to the crowd, and he said to the people there, he said, I know one of the things people here are worried about is that during this wave of persecution, you will get passed over and won't be martyred for Christ. And you're worried that that will impact your relationship with God. You're worried that you will miss out on that glorious opportunity. And he said, you know what? Don't worry. God sees your heart. He knows you're willing to do it. If you don't get picked up and martyred, just know that God knows you wanted to, and he's going to accept that too. And I go, man, that sounds completely different than the church today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I cannot imagine if those things were all happening today, the church would go, oh, don't worry, you'll get your chance to get martyred. No way. That's not what we would do. And it's convicting and challenging to hear people like that and to recognize how far we have fallen from where we once were and what we prioritize now. And so I think we can learn so very much from these people. And remember, they're brothers in Christ. Hebrews 11 tells us of this great hall of faith. And then Hebrews 12:1 says that, because of this great cloud of witnesses, go and live in a Christ-like manner. And I don't think that the great cloud of witnesses stopped then, even though we don't have, biblical heroes of faith anymore. We have a church that has been going for 2,000 years that God has been doing great things through. And when we learn what he's been doing through his people, it helps us to do a better job to follow him as his people. And so I think there are unbelievable plethoras of reasons. And why should you listen to their old sermons? Because they're full of wisdom. You would think that these old sermons written to people dealing with the Pope or dealing with Roman Empire, you would think that has nothing to do with your life. But I always tell people, if I could show you in my inbox how many times the word relevant has been sent to me, that sermon was just what I needed this week. Man, I can't believe how relevant these sermons are from the past. You would change your perspective on it completely. These are great men of God. You don't have to worry about their church going down in a scandal. They've been dead for 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years. Their scandals are known. There's nothing new coming out. And you can rely on them for good biblical teaching. And you're going to find that they are relevant. Sermons are relevant. I think it's because even though they lived in different conditions than you and I do today, the truth doesn't change. And humans have been struggling with the same thing for 2,000, 4,000 since we've been on earth. And so good truth applied to the people, you can find that applicable to us today as much as they did back then.
Yeah. Yeah, the fact that that God establishes the world, and then we from his both his general and specific revelation form our Christian worldview. It's no wonder that we should be able to kind of link arms with these brothers and sisters who have the more the things change, the more they stay the same. There's just more technology out in the world, and you just realize that people tend to be people. Remember reading Gregory of Nazianzus. It was just a short sermon that you gave me, but I think he was blessing the people out in the field right before communion or baptism, something like that. And the translation at least made it seem like just someone full of love. And we think of these people, 300 or so years after the last apostle, are these staunchy people in weird looking poses in frescoes or what have you, but the words that they spoke were loving and just I don't want to use the R word immediately, but you feel the kind of the same thing that you would when you're surrounded by the people in the church service. If the forecast of the snow doesn't make you stay home because you might have to scrape off your car twice because of it. Yeah. But yeah.
No, it's true. And I feel like too, as well, is that I'm glad that you mentioned that aspect of it too, because so many people are, I love these great theologians. I love reading these great books. But before these guys were theologians, almost all of them were pastors. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we forget that the reason we read any of their books today is because they pastored their church well enough that people wanted to hear their opinions, usually on other things. And so that aspect of them, their love and heart for their people as shepherds, is why we care about the books and theology they wrote. If they didn't do that part well, I don't think we'd probably want to read their books. But so often we segment them as, that's a great brain right there. Let me just pick the brain. It's like, no, you need to bring that heart with you. And I find that you can get that heart in their sermons.
And I think too, the sermons give you a specific point in that person's life as well, because they might not use as many jokes as we probably do in our sermons today, and I'm probably more guilty of it than anybody.
I remember I remember one time somebody messaged me and said, "Hey, did people not tell jokes back then?" And I hadn't noticed it until that point that I was like, you know what? Actually, there are not that many jokes. Occasionally, there really are a few. I've caught them where they're being witty, where they kind of say something a little silly. It doesn't quite like it's not as direct of a joke as maybe ours are, but I'm like, okay, that he's being funny right here. But it's true. Like comparatively, this person told me they went to a Baptist seminary, Southern Baptist one. They were like, my professor told me we have to have like a joke every 3 minutes or we lose the audience. So imagine my surprise when all these sermons you keep sending out never have any jokes at all.
Yeah. Well, and I'm currently reading a biography on J. Gresham Mencken, and it's amazing to kind of I know his place in history, but the fact that he almost didn't become a minister, the fact that he wanted to do New Testament work but struggled with belief to the point for him, I think it was more like, am I being honest with everybody that I could possibly interact with, God, if he exists, myself, and then the people that I would preach to? Can I be honest and say that I truly believe this? And so it's interesting to see those moments. And then when he'll talk about a sermon that he preached, he says, "Oh, I almost too briefly went over Romans 8:26a," and it's like, you did a whole sermon on just a fraction of a verse, and drilled down into it, and so you just have those moments where you kind of are input into their audience and experience not the mythic of the men and women, but kind of that moment. And so that's what I appreciate about these. I think John Gill was talking in remembrance of a bad storm that had blown through. And that was really impressive because we tend to have this maybe tying too much with, look at this moment in Scripture and we're going to tie it exactly into that. But the way that he was able to bring in the Jesus calming the storm and this remembrance of a time when a true gale force devastated this area is impressive, and I think it humanizes is probably the wrong word, but it allows us to come alongside and just relate to it, for lack of my better word.
Yeah, I love that sermon, and you wouldn't believe the hassle that sermon. And there's a lot of sermons that I've had to put out that take a while to get recorded. When you recorded that sermon, I had edited that sermon over a year prior to that, and I sent it to multiple people, and just nobody would read it. Like 2 or 3 different people just quit on it, didn't read it, and I was like, man, is it this sermon? So I was really happy when you finally did read it and sent it to me. I think we were actually getting ready. I'm pretty sure we were getting ready to go to Cambodia at that time too. So it was really nice. I was like, oh, good. It's coming in. We needed that right now. So it was really helpful. And I thought it was a great sermon too. I was like, this is a really interesting thing by a really important Baptist theologian that would not be remembered. It all came together well. And the number of times that kind of thing has happened with one of our sermons where it comes together right at the last moment, or I've had sermons take 1 or 2 years to get out. And then when it came out the week of, someone's like, hey, that was the week I needed it. So I've become very much just like, Lord, if you're sending this sermon in right now, it's because that's the one people must need right now. So I trust the process.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. The fact that history is just weird. I love history of any variety, and I'm teaching my children to love history. And I echo the same ideas as we don't know why we're at where we're at if we don't know where we came from. And we can relate to not just our ancestors, but the people that conquered them, or the people that that fell to them. And so just reading about specific war battles and how, like, my own grandfather was in the African trenches being shelled by the Germans, and he jumped into a foxhole and cut up his feet and won his Purple Heart that way. And when he came out of the shelling the next morning, there's an unexploded bomb right in front of him. And if that would have exploded, I wouldn't be here, and none of his generations would be here. And so it's amazing to think about those moments, or in the Civil War, two men are overlooking a battlefield, and they pull out a satchel to smoke cigars that they see, and there are the plans to the next battle that Lee's going to engage in. And then, if you were to write this in a movie script, people would say, well, this wouldn't happen. This is so stupid. None of these coincidences happen. None of these weird things occur. But when we do, when we can't make up history, and we just let it unfold and let it speak for itself, and realize that, World War II did not only just start on December 7th, 1941 for America, but we can go all the way back to Japan's isolation, or even more so, and realize how interconnected everything is. So
I always try to teach, and this is controversial, but I stand by it because I really hate this guy, that World War II started when Woodrow Wilson signed the Treaty of 1919. He's the reason World War II, in my opinion, occurs. And I know there are other people that are bad, but I put it all on one man's feet, and I will carry that prejudice with me.
Hating Woodrow Wilson should be a rite of passage for every
exactly.
Person. So yes, I'm with you there. And there's more reasons to hate him, to the point of throwing him out of office even again. So, but
I think the Catholics have this nice process of burning people in effigy. I think it's ridiculous. But if there was one person we might make an exception for, for me, it's Woodrow Wilson.
There you go. All right. So when I brought the topic to you, what came to mind?
All right. So it's funny because we just put out a deep dive. It's for these episodes. Normally, if you do listen to Revive Thoughts, sermons of the past, but we have these certain episodes where we'll take on a subject, very specific subject that usually is very much untouched by other people, especially Christians. We really want to dig into history from the perspective, I'm a believer. So what's happening here from a Christian perspective? And we just put out an episode on the Taiping Rebellion, very understudied subject. People, I don't know why Christians don't study this. When I explain it to people, it's like a hook. And I go, hey, did you know that 20 million or more people in China fell under a guy's basic belief that he was Jesus's brother? He made them all go to church. He made them read the Bible every day. And if they didn't listen, he cut off their heads. And that lasted for 15 years and almost completely overthrew the Chinese empire. To me, I'm like, I want to know more about that story. But we were the first, I think we're not the first, we're one of the first Christian podcasts I've ever seen ever cover this weird story. That story is one of the most coincidence-ridden stories of human history. And you might say, give me some examples. There are so many examples, it's almost difficult to start them. I mean, there's moments where at one point, the guy who leads it, I won't spoil it, but I'll just say he gets into some trouble. His older brother gets let off for reasons unknown to anybody. And this older brother will try to start the same kingdom again 30 years later and also get let off for reasons unknown, and will manage to it's just crazy stuff like that. Where how many things can go weird in this. At one point, a general will break out and go down to Taiwan. He'll become like a bandit, to Vietnam. He'll become like a bandit king. Then the Vietnamese will make him their official soldier against the French. He'll eventually have to leave. He'll go to Taiwan, where the Japanese are invading, and he'll end up leading the very people that once tried to kill him in the war against Japan. And it's just what in the world kind of story is this? So that I can't even begin to do it justice. You just have to go listen to it. Yeah, but when I think of you want to hear one of the weirdest coincidences. Oh, go ahead. Oh,
I was just going to say, I remember that episode, and listening to the person that kind of gave him scripture resources, and you're like, is it good that he might not have gotten the gospel, or is it weird how he got it too? Because where he got his material from, he just seemed to imagine almost a tract. And we kind of throw those by the wayside and think nothing of them, or think of them as a useful kind of, here's the basics of the gospel. But from this tract, he convinces himself, that he's almost this demigod to lead the rebellion. And from there, you're just like, wow, what would have happened if this one person didn't meet this one person on almost literally a road and give him this tract that he took and ran with it, literally.
It's interesting to me because Bible tracts, two of the most important people that ever lived in China's history, this guy, Hung Shu-Chuan, and then Hudson Taylor, both had their interactions with God through a Bible tract. Hudson Taylor, a Bible tract was handed to him. It brings him back to Christ. and he goes to become a missionary in China. Yay. But this other guy gets his track and convinces himself he's Jesus' brother. And it's just, like you said, it's just this crazy moment where, like, look at these two people showing up in China around the same time. Both of them will impact China for eternity. And yet they both interact with China because of a Bible track. But the difference in how these two interactions occur, you could not, there's definitely Satan's guy and then there's God's guy, and they definitely have very different ways they walk. So that one, I love that story because of it's just full of weird stuff. But I do remember after we finished recording, I was like to my co-host Joel, like, you could not write that movie because no one would believe that movie was real at all.
Yeah.
Now,
exactly.
But I will say one of the greatest moments of coincidences is from the story of Joan of Arc. I mean, you may say, okay, Joan of Arc, well, the crazy girl who heard the voice of God.
Right.
And that's kind of how I approached it too, originally. But after doing hours of research and putting together the episode, I have to be honest with you. If she was crazy, she was the most like spot on crazy that there has ever been. Like her ability to crazy in the right direction is a masterful, because she claims I had a vision, and the vision wasn't even directly from God. It was like some angels talked to her, but it's a little confusing. But she claimed she could hear the voice of God and that God was telling her to get the king of France and get him crowned. And if she did that, France would survive and win. And anytime I tell that story, the immediate reaction of most people is, and why would God want France to win anyway? And I don't know. That's in his mysterious providence. Why he didn't just let the English run France. And sure, the food might not have been as good, but it still would have probably been better. And we wouldn't have had the Paris Olympics that way, probably. But Joan of Arc convinces everybody, convinces the king, convinces the advisors. Now, the king of France, his father had gone insane. So he was very susceptible to the slander. Hey, are you going to go insane too? So think of how dangerous it is for what he rules for a long time. He's a very logical, chill guy. Think how dangerous it is for him to hand over his armies to this girl, Joan of Arc, when the rumor already is you might become crazy like your dad. So either he did go crazy, but there's no evidence of that. He ran the country for a while. He did a really great job. Or there's something special about Joan of Arc, that she just continuously confounded both the French and the English, and they could not explain her story at all. I mean, theologians would ask her questions about God, and they had this thing in the Catholic Church. We don't have it today. Back then, though, they would say, hey, do you believe that you are saved by God? And when if I ask you that question, Patrick, do you think you're going to go to heaven? Do you think you're saved by God?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we as Protestants, we Christians now today, of course, I believe his word, Jesus saves me. I believe the promises, but you weren't allowed to say that back in those medievaler times, because the Catholic Church had convinced everybody, if you say yes, you're claiming to know the will of God. You're claiming to know God's mind and his destiny for you, and you can't possibly as a human know that. But you can't say no either, because if you say no, then you're saying you're not a Christian. And so it was kind of like one of those questions like Jesus gets, who do I pay taxes to? There was no right answer, right? And Joan of Arc gets that question. She's a peasant girl. The English have been trying her in trial. They bring out this theologian. He asks her this impossible question, and she just goes, if I'm not saved by God, then I'm the most pitiful creature ever. If I am saved by God, I'm grateful that he saved me. And everyone in the court just sits there and stares at her like, what do we do with that? That was supposed to be our gotcha moment. We should have been able to get her for heresy, and we can't do anything with that answer. It's perfect. It blows the mind. But there's one moment in her story where you almost like you take your headphones off and just stare at the wall and go, how did that even happen? She's leading the army down, and the army is hungry. It's like it's the middle of February. The army has been struggling. She had been saying, hey, we need to go crown the king. They take off. They end up killing this massive English army. They surprise attack. The English had no idea they were there. It just wipes them out. And as they're going, they're getting hungrier and they're getting hungrier. But it's winter and there's no food nearby. And Joan of Arc basically is like, let's go stop at this town over here. When they get there, this town has covered in a type of food that is harvested early called beans. In fact, this town has only grown this one type of food that happens to be harvestable right at that moment when they arrive. And when they ask, like, why did you grow only beans? They said, well, there was this preacher who was like an end of the world preacher, came to town, said the world was going to end this year, and we needed to plant some food to hide in the mountains with. And the only food that would be ready in time was beans. So we planted only beans. And I guess now you can eat the beans because you're the king. And it's like, what? Like, okay, yeah, I want to say that's crazy, but how else do you explain how she fed the army with beans? Like, there's just so many weird things in her story where you want to be like, that's stupid, but also it worked. So I don't know. That to me is one of the greatest coincidences of all time of just, hey, let's go get some food from this town. Oh, look, it's Bean Town. They happen to have the only food that's available at this time of year. And it's the only food they planted. So it'll be plenty of it. It's got, I mean, I can only imagine it was a gassy camp afterwards, but it was a full camp. And that's pretty good.
Well, the French are known for various smells, so I'm just saying we've come to expect it. Wow. Yeah.
So on the coincidence levels, I feel like that's about as high of a coincidence as you can get.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to see these types of people who, I mean, they stand out to us because kind of history records them. But I was fascinated with Alfred the Great, the only British king to ever hold the mantle of the Great, and reading books, and you don't realize just how impactful the Vikings were, and how amazing they were, terribly amazing, literally at war, and just there were prayers for early winters so that their raids would stop. And eventually, Alfred the Great would marry his daughters to one of the Viking kings, and the fact that he would do this, and he in Christian kind of solitude, he gave over his own children to kind of hopefully foster this relationship. And so this king comes over and sacks his land again, and steals his treasure and the people's possessions out there, and he's able to capture his sons, the king's sons, Alfred the Great is, and all his advisors are saying like, oh, execute them, show them what it means to turn against them, and he brings forth the king and says, I have your sons, and here they are, along with my daughters, and here, if you wanted anything, you could have just asked. And so he did this because he had this conviction of, listen, I'm a Christian, I'm a man of my word. We made promises, and just because a particular person within this agreement doesn't hold his side of the bargain, doesn't mean that I would. And it fostered this settle down period where the main Viking horde didn't raid again for several years. And you just think, here's a man who has a biblical conviction, and Alfred the Great is to me on par with people like I can't pull anybody from memory, but he's this almost artifact out of time, and he's wanting the people to read, and he's building hospitals and universities for the common person because he wants his people to be bolstered up by knowing God's world and knowing the written word so that they can read scripture or sermons for themselves and be educated. So it's amazing to see these moments in history where people did unexpected things because it's so easy to kind of have followed the trend of, well, she's a woman, we can't trust her, yada, yada, yada. And here, the French survived because of it. And we've got some amazing stories from there, and I think more men should learn from Alfred the Great. I really would like a picture of him next to various other people in history, because I was just so enamored by his story, and I was enamored because the story that kind of people know about him of a woman baking bread and then swatting his hand, not knowing that he was the king and he was gracious about it, is actually like this thing that never really happened, but kind of talks about his character. And so the story that people know him from is not
George Washington. cutting down the cherry tree moments and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, the Vikings themselves, like just the fact that we don't have Vikings today, of course, we have airplanes and whatever. But the point is that the reason we don't have Vikings today was because the Christians took care of them, sent people to them, and made it their goal. Men like Boniface, who looked at these people who were just absolutely terrifying, who would happily drink out of the skulls of their enemies. I mean, not just as like, that's a cartoonish thing. Like, no, that's actually what they did. And he said, let's go bring them the gospel. He gave his life for it. There are many others who did as well, but it worked. Like, it took time. It was not overnight, but it's worked. That's one of the things I learned that really fascinated me. When you think of Europe and Christianity, culture today, it's like, oh yeah, Christianity has always been European. No, it wasn't. Like, there was a point in history where you basically around the 5th and 6th century, it looked like Europe was never going to be Christian, that Christianity was going to be a North African, Middle Eastern religion. And only a little tribe in the Franks and a little bit of the Irish were still keeping it going during that time, and maybe Rome itself. And it is actually quite fascinating how close Christianity multiple times got to being extinguished, how viciously the Vikings and the Gallic tribes fought back against it. And yet, over time, the gospel moved. Sadly, as the gospel moved through and brought these pagan tribes to Christ, the places where the gospel had once been so strong, North Africa and the Middle East, gave into Islam, and it left Christianity. But still, just this idea that like Christianity was certainly not a European religion in the beginning, and in many ways, Europe resisted it very heartily, and the Vikings are the greatest example of that, and they're the greatest example of enemies turn to Christ. I mean, now Norway and Sweden and Finland are not particularly scary places in the world, but there was definitely a time when they were the scariest places you could have possibly had.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been reading some works, and I want to read more from Raymond Ibrahim, who is turning my mind a lot about the Crusades and all versions of the Crusades. And it's just amazing. I actually
have a really great coincidence story from the Crusades, if you would like to hear that one. Here we go.
Yeah.
So during the First Crusade, the Crusaders are taking cities. They end up taking the city of Antioch. Antioch, wild time. I don't have time for that one. It's a great story, though. We did a deep dive on it. I'm going to check it out. But the army, the Crusaders are almost completely starved out and destroyed, but they end up taking Antioch, and literally pretty much the next day after they take it, the biggest army they have seen yet shows up outside, and they knew it was coming. That's why they really had to take Antioch really fast. So they turn around. They've been sieging the city for over a year. They then have to turn around and live in the city they've been sieging to now get sieged against by this really massive army that has shown up to destroy them. And of course, the city's out of food and everything because it's been a siege city for the last year. So it's not a great place to be. And they go to the priest and they basically say, priest, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to attack the enemy army? Are we supposed to stay in here? And the priests at this time have been praying. They don't know. And one night the priests are praying like, God, send us a sign. And they watch as a meteorite flashes across the night sky and lands in the enemy camp. And they go, hey, we think that's a sign God wants you to attack. And it's like, And the thing is, this army is way bigger than this, and outmatching them 4-1. But when the Crusaders ride out, they win the battle. And again, I don't think that God was probably but what do you say to that, though?
Yeah.
On the other side of it, it's like, well, if you're asking God for a sign, a meteorite that falls out of the sky, it's really hard not to say that's a sign. I don't know what you do with stuff like that. I read that and I go, I want to say no, but how do I say no to that? Like, I just don't know what I'm supposed to say. So anyway, the priests, by the way, after that are challenged. The Crusaders are kind of like, are you really listening to God? Or are you just kind of making up as you go along? This one priest says, I will do a trial. Let's test us and see if we're right. And so he says, hey, they kind of look through their Bibles and they go, oh, look, there's this story of a guy Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They go into the fire. We're in the area of the Middle East. Let's do it. So they get a really hot fire going, and this priest is going to walk through the fire. And if he's going to come out, he's not going to die. And that's going to be the proof that God is with him. Priest goes into the fire, and he does come out. And he almost immediately falls over because he's burnt to a crisp. And sadly, he dies a week later from the burns. But he did technically live. And the test was seen as not super conclusive, but it didn't look good for the priest after that.
Well, repeated tests. So, that we're in the scientific age, so repeated tests. So, yeah. It's fascinating to see how ignorant of history we can be by putting Christianity as the white man's religion, when you just realize the effort that places like Egypt, or our early church fathers who struggled against each other and against Rome and against being pushed around by the world, Athanasius and the rest of them, and how central essentially the Middle East, Africa was. Even the Crusades, you have these stories of El Cid or Richard the Lionheart, and I'm listening to these stories, and these are the hero characters. This is the person that you take over in civilization to lead your army, because they're the uber character.
Or Age of Empires, too.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sure we probably could all trace our history back to these video games to help us. But it's crazy because there's almost like a berserker power. Richard the Lionheart is going out there and he's just slaughtering people who are attacking him, and people are scared to face the king. They have to wait until he's like sick in bed, and he pulls on his armor and takes out his sword and beats back like this Muslim horde that is attacking his camp. And he almost single-handedly, these are kings that are going out into battle, or listening about the true story of Vlad the Impaler, and just how precious they viewed going out and not just protecting Holy Land and capturing Holy Land, although you watch them lay siege to holy cities and then almost have these vomitous expressions of faith because they're in the holy city. But like they go out and they save Christians who are being like can't be said on YouTube because of how nasty just history is. And you just realize, a lot of the stuff that I was told to hate about history is kind of supplanted because, like you said, there are people who are in academia who want to push a certain agenda, and there are reasons for that is for a different podcast. But just seeing the love for other Christian brothers and sisters who aren't of royal lineage, or these ideas of like prima nocta and the rule of absolute monarchs, and you just genuflect before the king. But here are the kings going out, riding into battle, thinking that they're important. Or Saint Louis, he reading about his story of France during the time. I mean, to call him fanatical Christian is an underscore. Reading about his life and just realizing that we kind of have this almost Disney-esque version of history, at least I do, planted in us, where these ruling kings are wanting you to genuflect before them and kiss the ring, but these are the same people then who are making themselves physically sick by giving alms to the poor in such a fashion. So it's pretty amazing to read these first-hand accounts and the sermons that you kind of bring up in these moments of history are so good to get us into not just what a historian said about history, but it puts us in those areas. And we might not understand all the context or anything like that, but we can find these primary sources and just go, oh wow, that's a lot different than the Disney version of self-hatred that I'm supposed to kind of ascribe to. Yeah.
And I always think too, if you're scared of history and you go, but I don't know, like they were violent during those times, just remind yourself, it is an important thing. You've never had to deal with the Muslim Empire encroaching on your lands and killing your people and all. You've never had to deal with Vikings showing up and raiding your homes, and how you would have to react to that. That's the world they live in. You've grown up in a cold world, or a post 9/11 world, whatever, all these different kind of worlds we live in. We have a very different reality than they did in those days. You could be living happy and suddenly 20,000 Mongolians show up and take over like a third of Europe all by accident.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a different time period. And so Christians could not completely act like maybe you would want them to, because I think if you were living in their time period, you too would also be taking out the sword and going, we have to fight or do something or we will be wiped out. That doesn't mean every fight was right, but also the pacifism that I think people today often kind of lean on. And yet none of us would say that America jumping in and saving World War, ending World War II was bad. So why is one war in one time okay or the other? You know what I'm saying? Like we're okay with one war of defense, but then we'll not be okay with another war. And I think we just need to be careful to remind ourselves that, hey, those are our brothers, sisters in Christ. At least some of them are. I know some of them are probably Catholics that are worshiping just Mary, but some of them are our brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's give them some grace. They'll be in heaven with us. And yeah, you know what? Maybe I wouldn't do what they did. And I don't know that I necessarily think I agree with all the things they did for sure.
Right.
However, I hope that people show us grace when they look back at us and say, well, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And where were you when this was going on?
Right. We can all be safe to say now, that all men should be free, and that slavery is an abomination unto the Lord. But that same statement 200 and some odd years ago will get you lynched, no matter what color you are, and no matter what part of the United States Mason-Dixon line you fall on. And seeing the tradition of Christians to come in and take the unpopular opinions, even against kind of what's considered mainline in their day, and paying the ultimate price because they're convinced that this is truly a crime against of those made in the image of God.
I mean, actually, if I recall, I read the statistic one time that 1/4 of those who were lynched were not actually Black people. It was actually white people who were fighting for Black people's rights to freedom. That doesn't, negate that the other 3/4 were, Black people being killed by the KKK. But it wasn't just them. It was the people who were willing to say, I don't care what happens. I still believe we should treat people as their image God bearers, who are taking that, that pain and that consequence from it.